Goldsmith was short, about 5 feet 5 or 6, strong but not heavy in build, rather fair in complexion with brown hair, such as could be distinguished from his wig.
His features were plain, but not repulsive. Certainly not so when lighted by conversation. His manners were simple, natural, and not particularly polished.
He talked without premeditation and laughed loudly without restraint.
It was impossible not to love and admire his good qualities.
His benevolence was unquestionable, and his countenance bore every trace of it.
No one that knew him intimately could avoid admiring those good qualities.
However, he seems from infancy to have been compounded of 2 natures, one bright, the other blundering.
Most of the ludicrous scenes and ridiculous incidents in his works have been drawn from his own blunders and mischances.
His genius was great, but his knowledge was small.
No man was more foolish when he had not a pen in his hand, or more wise when he had.
But let not his frailties be remembered. He was a very great man. He left scarcely any style of writing untouched, and touched nothing that he did not adorn.
I was born on the 10th of November 1728 in the hamlet of Palace, here in the county of Longford. I came from a respectable but by no means thrifty stock. Some families seem to inherit kindliness and incompetency, and to pass down virtue and poverty from generation to generation. Such was the case with my own.
They were always a strange family. They rarely acted like other people. Their hearts were in the right place, but their heads seemed to be doing anything but what they ought. They were remarkable for their worth, but of no cleverness in the ways of the world.
My father, the Reverend Charles Goldsmith, married when very young and very poor, and starved along for several years on a small country curacy and the assistance of his wife's friends. His whole income, eked out by the produce of some fields which he farmed, did not exceed £40.
And passing rich with £40 a year.
He inhabited an old rustic mansion that stood on rising ground in a rough, lonely part of the country, overlooking a low tract occasionally flooded by the River Inny. In this house Goldsmith was born, and it was a birthplace worthy of a poet, for by all accounts it was haunted ground. Tradition has it that in later years, when it fell into decay, it became so lonely and forlorn as to become a resort for the good people, or fairies, who are supposed to delight in old, crazy, dilapidated mansions for their midnight revels.
About 2 years after Oliver's birth, a change came over the circumstances of his father. By the death of an uncle, he succeeded to the rectory of Kilkenny West and removed to Lissoy in Westmeath, where he occupied a farm of 70 acres, situated on the skirts of that pretty little village.
This was the scene of Goldsmith's boyhood, the little world whence he draws so many of those pictures, rural and domestic, whimsical and touching, that abound throughout his works.
My father told us that universal benevolence and goodwill was what cemented society, and we were taught to consider all the wants of mankind as our own. In a word, we were perfectly instructed in the art of giving away thousands before we were taught the necessary qualification of receiving a farthing. His house was known to all the vagrant chain. He tripped their wanderings but relieved their pain. The long-remembered beggar was his guest, whose beard descending swept his aged breast. The ruined spendthrift, now no longer proud, claimed kindred there and had his claims allowed. The broken soldier, kindly bade to stay, sat by his fire and talked the night away. Wept o'er his wounds or tales of sorrow done, shouldered his crutch and showed how fields were won. Pleased with his guests, the good man learned to know and quite forgot their vices in their woe. Careless their merits or their faults to scan, his pity gave, ere charity began.
The family of the worthy pastor consisted of 5 sons and 3 daughters. Henry, the eldest, was the good man's pride and hope, and he stretched his slender means to give him an education for a learned and distinguished career. Oliver, the second son, was 7 years younger than Henry, who was the guide and protector of his childhood, and to whom he was most tenderly attached throughout his life.
Oliver's education began when he was about 3 years old. That is to say, he was gathered under the wings of one of those good old motherly dames found in every village, who clubbed together the whole callow brood of the neighbourhood to teach them their letters and keep them out of harm's way.
Mistress Elizabeth the Lap, for that was her name, worked for upwards of 50 years in this capacity, and it was her proud boast when, at nearly 90 years of age, she declared,
I was the very first to put a book in the infant Goldsmith's hands. Oh, but poor little Oliver didn't much profit by it, for I have to confess he was one of the dullest boys I ever had the misfortune to teach. But he was too easily beguiled by fancy imaginings. I didn't think it was possible to make anything of him.
at 6 years of age, he passed into the hands of the village schoolmaster, one Thomas Byrne, a former army quartermaster who now drilled the urchin populace of Lissoy. He is remembered as one of the best-known teachers in all of literature.
Beside yon straggling fence that skirts the way, with blossomed firs unprofitably gay, there in his noisy mansion skill to rule, the village master taught his little school.
A man severe he was and stern to view, I knew him well, and every truant knew. Well had the boding tremblers learned to trace the day's disasters in his morning face.
Full well they laughed, with counterfeited glee, at all his jokes, for many a joke had he. Full well the busy whisper circling round conveyed the dismal tidings when he frowned.
Yet he was kind, or if severe in aught, the love he bore to learning was in fault. The village all declared how much he knew. 'Twas certain he could write, and cipher too.
Lands he could measure, terms and tides presage, and e'en the story ran that he could gauge. In arguing too the parson owned his skill, for e'en though vanquished, he could argue still.
While words of learned length and thundering sound amazed the gazing rustics ranged around.
And still they gazed, and still the wonder grew, that one small head could carry all he knew.
Old Thomas Byrne was fond of talking of his vagabond wanderings in foreign lands, and had brought with him from the wars a world of campaigning stories. These travellers' tales had a powerful effect upon the vivid imagination of Goldsmith, and awakened an unconquerable passion for wandering and seeking adventure.
The schoolmaster also had a disposition to dabble in poetry, and this likewise was caught up by his pupil. Before he was 8 years old, Goldsmith had the habit of scribbling verses on small scraps of paper, which in a little while he would throw into the fire. A few of these scraps, however, were rescued by his mother, who read them with delight.
Charles, the boy is a genius and a poet. Well, just take a look at this.
John Trot was desired by two witty peers to tell them the reason why asses had ears.
A genius! We must give him an education suitable to his talents.
My dear, we can barely afford the cost of Henry's education. I thought we'd bring Oliver up to some useful, beneficial trade, like handicrafts.
I love handicrafts. The boy must follow his muse.
And devote himself to poverty. Surely not, my dear.
But a severe attack of the smallpox caused me to be taken from the care of the village schoolmaster. My malady nearly proved fatal, and my face remained pitted for the rest of my life.
On his recovery, he was placed under the charge of the Reverend Griffin, schoolmaster of Elphin, and stayed at the house of his uncle John Goldsmith of Ballyocta. He now entered upon more demanding studies, but without making any discernible progress.
Still, an easy disposition, an amusing eccentricity of manners, and a vein of quiet and peculiar humour rendered him a general favourite. And a trifling incident soon induced his uncle's family to concur in his mother's opinion of his genius.
A number of young folks had gathered at his uncle's house to dance. In the course of the evening, Oliver undertook a hornpipe. His short and clumsy figure and his face, pitted and discoloured by smallpox, rendered him ludicrous in the eyes of the musician.
He's like a little Aesop with his ugly mug and his panty legs.
Our herald hath proclaimed the saying, see Aesop dancing and his monkey playing!
Wonderful! Wonderful! Such repartee from a boy of 9 years of age! Oliver truly is the bright genius and wit of the family! He must receive the best of schooling!
And spurred on by his mother, several of his relatives agreed to contribute toward the expense.
Most notably his uncle, the Reverend Thomas Contarine, a kind-hearted man with a generosity beyond his means.
I was fitted out by my dear considerate uncle and transferred to schools of a higher order where I knew I would make my mark.
However, he did not distinguish himself among his teachers, but was popular among his schoolmates. He had a thoughtless generosity, extremely captivating to young hearts. His temper was quick and sensitive and easily offended. But his anger was momentary, and it was impossible for him to harbour resentment. He was the leader of all boyish sports and athletic amusements, especially ball playing. Yes, very good. And he was foremost in all mischievous pranks.
A famous incident is related as occurring in Goldsmith's last journey homeward from school in Edgeworthstown. His father's house was about 20 miles distant. The road lay through rough country, impassable for carriages. Goldsmith procured a horse for the journey, and a friend furnished him with a guinea for travelling expenses. He was but a stripling of 16, but being thus mounted on horseback, with money in his pocket, it's no wonder his head was turned. He determined to play the man in independent traveller's style. Accordingly, instead of pushing directly for home, he halted for the night in the little town of Arda.
Good evening, sir. Could you direct me to the best house in this place? I have need of supper and a bed for the night.
I certainly don't, sir. That fine mansion over there, see, to be honest, the best hereabouts, known for the finest of hospitality. I work there myself, betime.
Why, thank you, good man. It will suit me perfectly.
Well, in that case, allow me to take your horse to the stables. Mr. Featherstone, the landlord, will be delighted to welcome you to his hostelry.
Why, thank you, my kind fellow.
Oh, this young Egypt is going to give us a jest for the ages.
Good evening, sir.
Ah, good evening, landlord.
I beg your pardon.
Oh, your boy told me to make myself at home.
Did he indeed?
I hope I'm in good time for supper.
For supper, sir?
Mm-hmm.
Was ever such request made to a man in his own house?
Yes, sir, supper, sir. I begin to feel an appetite. I do believe I'll make devilish work in the larder tonight, I promise you.
Such a brazen dog, sir, never my eye beheld. Well, sir, as for supper, I can't properly tell. My Dorothy and the cook maid usually settle these things between them.
So you've no idea what's on the menu?
Menu?
Uh,
Now I perceive this to be one of young Kelly's jests. Well, I did hear talk of pig and prune sauce.
Capital! To a man that is hungry, pig and prune sauce is very good eating. And what have you pray for pudding?
Well, we usually have a dish of taffety cream to offer our guests.
Oh, that sounds most delicious.
I can vouch for it, sir.
And perhaps you and your good wife will join me in this evening's feast.
It will be an honour, sir.
And let us crown it with a bottle of your best claret.
Excellent. I'll fetch our finest vintage directly.
And when I think of it, please tell the kitchen to bring me a hot oatcake tomorrow for my breakfast.
Very good, sir.
And please ensure my bed is well aired.
Ed, he's the one who needs an airing. This beaming whelp is fooled to the top of his bent. We'll play along till morning time.
Imagine poor Goldsmith's confusion and dismay. But true to his habit of turning the events of his life to literary account, we find this chapter of ludicrous blunders and cross purposes dramatized many years afterwards in his dramatic masterpiece,
She Stoops to Conquer, or The Mistakes of the Night.
The time had now come for Oliver to be sent to the university, and accordingly, in June 1745, when 16 years of age, he entered Trinity College, Dublin. But his father could no longer afford to pay for his studies and was obliged to enter him as a sizer, or poor scholar. He was lodged in the top of one of the rooms adjoining the library of the building numbered 35, where it is said his name can still be seen today, scratched by himself into the window frame.
As a student of this class, I was taught and boarded gratuitously and had to pay but a very small sum for my room. In return, I was expected to render myself useful in a variety of ways. I was obliged to sweep part of the court in the morning, to carry up the dishes from the kitchen to my fellow's table, and to wait in the hall until that body had dined. My very mode of dress marked my inferiority to my happier classmates. It was a black gown of coarse stuff without sleeves, and a plain black cloth cap without a tassel.
Thus Goldsmith entered college with the utmost repugnance. His shy and sensitive nature was affected by the inferior station he was doomed to hold among his gay and opulent fellow students.
Furthermore, the death of his worthy father early in 1747 rendered his situation at college extremely difficult. His mother was left with barely the means to look after her own household, and he would have been compelled to leave college had it not been for the generous contributions of his uncle Contrary. Still, in the intervals between these donations, he was put to great straits.
At times I sank into a despondency, but I had what people termed a knack for hoping, which soon buoyed me up again.
He began now to resort to his poetical vein as a source of profit, scribbling street ballads, which he privately sold for 5 shillings each at a shop which dealt in such small wares of literature.
He felt an author's affection for these unowned bantlings, and would stroll